Metal Gear Solid 2 is, among other things, a commentary on the nature of human thought and perspective. When I say among other things, I mean a lot of other things. For that reason, I'll be doing a chapter-by-chapter format for this video. I intentionally don't do that in my other videos because it seems overdone to me, but any analysis of MGS2 sort of needs individual chapters. There are way too many things to discuss for me to put it all in a single stream of thought effectively. Oh, spoilers ahead. Before I start, I'd like to give my personal definition of postmodernism in art. Postmodern art commentates on the general nature or current state of a medium, or in the case of MGS2, art as a whole. People write entire essays defining the term postmodern, but a simple definition like this makes the term much more effective in my mind. The reason I say that Metal Gear Solid 2 fits this definition of postmodernism should be obvious by the time this essay's over. But to put a part of it simply, it spends a considerable amount of time acknowledging and reflecting on the fact that it's a sequel to a work in a medium that has inherent problems with canon. One player might have killed everyone in Shadow Moses, while another snuck through most of it. Metal Gear Solid 2 creating a definitive series of events that took place in Metal Gear Solid 1 ties in well with the essay's major idea, that your personal beliefs are more important than others' interpretations. What you did in Shadow Moses is more important than what Kojima says Snake did. Which leads us into the first chapter. The reason I started with this subject is because it relates to the very act of analyzing this game. Everything in this essay is going to be my own subjective truth. The game more or less asks you to share or at least hold on to your own ideas about the game, rather than seek out the absolute meaning behind it all.
There's no such thing in the world as absolute reality. Most of what they call real is actually fiction. What you think you see is only as real as your brain tells you it is. But everything you felt, thought about during this mission is yours, and what you decide to do with them is your choice.
Kojima wants us to have fun analyzing MGS2, and be secure in the knowledge that if we had fun, it was worth it, even if we never arrived at an absolute reality.
We can tell other people about having faith. What we had faith in. What we found important enough to fight for. It's not whether you were right or wrong, but how much faith you were willing to have. That decides the future.
We aren't meant to be right while analyzing MGS2, we're meant to see in it whatever we see, and relate to the game however we happen to, and to have faith that our own ideas about the game, and the art we observe in general, are, if nothing else, true to us. But even that is just my subjective truth, my interpretations of what I've seen in MGS2. For these reasons, I encourage you to interpret this essay as just that, my own subjective truth, and I encourage you to think about MGS2 and art in general on your own terms. Other people's subjective analyses should only be for entertainment and food for thought. There might be things about MGS2 that scream at you that I don't even touch on in this essay, or maybe you think MGS2 is just a train wreck that's not worth analyzing, and that's great. Subjective truths are what make us human, and they're all that we'll ever know for sure. The idea of subjective truths being all that we can rely on, and accepting that we'll never have an absolute grasp on reality, are the reasons for the completely convoluted plot of MGS2. You can do your best to piece it together and figure out what exactly happens over the course of the game, but that's not the point.
The Patriots are a kind of ongoing fiction too, come to think of it. Listen, don't obsess over words so much. Find the meaning behind the words, then decide. You can find your own name. And your own future.
The intimidating and messy plot serves to urge people to do just that. There are certain aspects of it, be it a small line of dialogue, or the plot's arc as a whole, that individuals will relate to their ideas about the game's message. However, there will always be tiny details that don't quite fit our analyses. Anomalies. That's where faith comes in. This idea of absolute truths gets its most prominence in the last 40 minutes or so of the game, when the GW AI is revealing its ideas about humanity to us, and when Snake is telling us how we relate to the truth as mere individuals. GW has the S3 plan, Selection for Societal Sanity. The idea is, as they put it, not to control content, but to create context. They intend to teach future generations about the real truth by de-emphasizing all of the half-truths that are made online and in groups of friends. GW says that humanity will go out with a whimper otherwise. People are afraid of leaving their echo chambers that reaffirm their biased, or at least incomplete beliefs about the world, and because of this, future generations will look back at the information we've left behind and won't be able to find any absolute truth, and therefore won't be able to interpret history's meaning. GW states that it intends to not only dig up the complete truth, but to interpret it also. I think that GW is an analog not for Kojima, but for what Kojima was probably tempted to be, an author who gives definitive answers on what exactly happened and what it all meant. This is why the GW AI, in spite of having some very good points,
I hear it's amazing when the famous purple stuffed worm in Flapjaw Space with the tuning fork does a raw blink on Harry Carey Rock. I need scissors. 61.
is ultimately the villain. In GW's future, mankind would have no need of personal beliefs, or faith in their ideals, and would ultimately cease to be human as a result. In MGS1, every player had their own Snake. That was sort of the whole idea. Snake was an insert for the player. He would act outside of our control sometimes, but his victories always reflected ours. He proves that anyone with a controller can be a Metal Gear fighting badass. However, by shifting away from Snake as the player character, we're forced to acknowledge that we're no longer Snake, and that, in the context of MGS2, we never were. It doesn't matter how you played MGS1, the quote-unquote real Snake did it his way. I'll go back to that Solid Snake quote.
Don't obsess over words so much. Find the meaning behind the words, then decide.
It doesn't really matter what Snake actually did in MGS1. Our Snake story is our own subjective truth, and we shouldn't throw that away just because some author says that this is how it really happened. When Snake talks down about virtual reality being used to train soldiers, we see a video of countless Solid Snake models all running in different directions. This, combined with the fact that Raiden had VR training before the plant mission, and that MGS2's Snake never had VR training, forces us to acknowledge, yet again, that MGS1 was just a video game. We may want to believe that we infiltrated Shadow Moses, defeated Liquid Snake, and destroyed Metal Gear Rex, but Snake is the one who did all of that. We just played a video game of it. Which brings us to our next topic. The disparity between Raiden and the player is represented throughout the entire plant section by the need to use first-person view versus third-person. Raiden doesn't like being controlled so closely by the player, and would much prefer we only use him in third-person view, from a distance. However, we eventually learn to coexist and work as one. Hear me out. By making a point to say that we weren't the ones who infiltrated Shadow Moses, there's already a very uncomfortable relationship between the player and Raiden. Raiden was designed to be unlikable, and yet we need to form a bond with him now that Snake has rejected us. The game told us that we didn't really defeat Metal Gear Rex, so now we want to make up for that by becoming Raiden. But we can't. We're just playing a video game, and Raiden isn't nearly as open to making us feel like him as Snake was. In MGS2, Snake rejects the role the player had in MGS1, and Raiden is left needing someone to control him. Ultimately, both Raiden and the player want to be Snake, and Raiden needs the player to become more like Snake, to roleplay as Snake. That's what I mean by an uncomfortable relationship. Raiden enjoyed being Snake in his VR simulations of Shadow Moses, and now that he's stuck with just himself, all he can do is hope to be Snake again, just like the player. He even sounds disappointed when the Colonel changes his codename from Snake to Raiden.
And by the way, Snake, we're changing your code name for all following communication.
What's wrong with Snake?
So we move on, uncomfortably in Raiden's shoes, until we meet Snake. Well, until we meet Pliskin. We know it's Snake, it's the same character with the same voice actor, but as he lies about his name, we still hold on to a glimmer of hope that he might not be Snake, if only so that we can roleplay as Snake for a bit longer. However, there's one more thing that gets in the way of our Snake fantasy: the camera. During the tanker mission, there are plenty of points where we get nice and comfortable with the first-person view in our favorite infiltrator's head. This serves as a tutorial for the new mechanic, and more importantly, to immerse ourselves deeper in Snake's role, which is of course brutally taken away from us as soon as we finish the tanker section and move on to Raiden. We ease ourselves into Raiden's role, not having to go into first person much, but soon, and for the rest of the game, we're going to have to constantly go into first person, immersing ourselves deeper than we're comfortable with inside of Raiden and the Big Shell. This is where the level design comes in, or more specifically the layout of the Big Shell. Raiden has to complete roughly 2.5 circles around the entirety of Shell 1 before he crosses over to Shell 2. The entire time he's doing this, we still aren't 100% certain that Solid Snake is really talking to us, and we can still carry on, ignoring our character model and pretending to be Snake. Raiden is, literally and figuratively, caught in a loop, and Snake's constant one-upping of Raiden is what keeps him in it, until, eventually, Raiden one-ups Snake, and he's pulled out of his loop. After our first loop around Shell 1, Raiden and Snake meet the bomb disposal expert, and are tasked to freeze a series of bombs around Shells 1 and 2. This is where we're brutally thrust into Raiden's head, and we're forced to start using first-person view extensively to scan each area for hidden C4. We can essentially think of first-person view as breaching Raiden and taking control of him, while third-person view represents a shaky relationship between us, with Raiden being farther away from us and more detached from our will. Snake always stays a bomb or two ahead of us until we freeze the second to last one, where he says that we're finally ahead of him. With this, another bomb activates and we're forced to run back to the very first area, something no other MGS game, with the meaningful exception of V, makes us do, and defuse the bomb. This is essentially Raiden's rebirth. When Snake says that we've frozen more bombs than he has, we finally learn that we can compete with Snake, and as a result we go back to the beginning of the game and start over with a newfound confidence in both ourselves and Raiden. Interestingly, the last time Raiden was here, he was still being called Snake, and he was wearing a mask. Now we're going back down with our face exposed. We're sort of, kind of, starting to like this guy. We still wish we were Snake, but we've finally seen Raiden do as well as Snake does. However, as I mentioned earlier, Raiden doesn't like it when we go into first person, and we had to do it a ton to defuse the bombs, so this glimmer of strength is immediately undercut by the Fortune boss fight, in which you can do nothing but dodge her attacks in third person until she gets interrupted by Vamp. Notably, we have no need to enter first person during the Fortune boss fight, and we'll probably die if we try to, which signifies Raiden's upcoming defiance to the player's will, partly due to his newly realized strength, and partly because of his frustration with the player's constant first-person view usage. We see Raiden break away from the player's actions for the first of many times. After a boss fight in which we didn't attack at all, Raiden decides to shoot Fortune during the cutscene, defying the player in a way that Snake never did in MGS1. Of course, without the player to guide the empty shell that is Raiden, he misses, and shoots Vamp in the head in the least honorable way possible. Vamp survives, further disheartening the player before he takes control over Raiden again. Raiden tried to act without the player rather than in sync with them as Snake did in MGS1, and suffered because of it. Clearly he needs us as much as we need him, but it's going to take some work to build that bond. Neither of us wants the other, but we have a mutual need of each other. However, Raiden and the player are about to learn a little bit more about working as one. After the Fortune fight, we rush in a semicircle around Shell 1 to get to Fat Man, the one who's been placing the C4.
I used to hang around department store clock counters.
Fat Man was hired by the Patriots to test how effective their mind-programmed soldier, Raiden, was at being like Snake. They make Raiden into Snake by putting him on the same sort of mission Snake was on before learning his independence from the player at the end of MGS1, and Raiden also gains independence from the player at the end of MGS2. Essentially, to make a solid Snake-esque soldier, you need to put them on a big mission with a player controlling them, and they'll naturally move on from the player's control and become independent. So, the first step of that plan is to merge Raiden with the player, the thing we've been having trouble with until this point. Back to Fat Man. As I said, Fat Man is the one who's been placing C4, and to defuse that C4 takes a skillful combination of third-person stealth and first-person coolant spraying. A combination of controlling Raiden from the outside and the inside, a sharing of responsibilities between the player and the player character. So Fat Man raised Raiden and the player to become one with each other, and now he's going to put that to the test. Defeating Fat Man involves, once again, a combination of first-person and third-person actions. So it takes teamwork between Raiden's third person and the player's first person. Raiden auto-aims onto Fat Man to keep track of him while he's off camera, and the player observes the environment to locate and defuse the C4. As a result of their teamwork, opposite to the way Raiden took control away from the player after the Fortune fight, here we see the player's skill represented in the cutscene, where Raiden's victory is one-to-one with the player's. Fat Man succeeded in merging us into one, and as a result, we passed his test of our oneness. With Raiden and the player beginning to form a comfortable understanding, we're ready to really accept him as the new player character. We're actually starting to like this guy. We have to go into the Shell 1 core and meet Ames, but first let's do a quick recap. We started out the plant chapter with a third-person dominated section of the game. We don't even have a gun, so no reason at all to go into first person. Then we started the bomb disposal, and we had to start using a bit of third person, but a hefty amount of first person to defuse them. Raiden didn't take kindly to that, so he rebelled by not going into first person at all during the Fortune fight, and shooting her when we didn't want him to during the cutscene. We then went on to fight Fat Man and learned to use first and third person actions together, working as one, and so Raiden's victory in cutscene coincided with ours in gameplay. Now we have almost no reason at all to use first person until we get to aims. So, now that we've bonded with Raiden by using first person view mixed with third person for the Fat Man fight, Raiden gets a little break in which he gets to use a ton of third person and hardly any first person. On our way to infiltrate the Shell 1 core, we grab the AK-74U that the guards use and make our way in. Here, we don a disguise of one of the guards to get past the security cameras. This disguise serves two purposes. Firstly, it's what enables us to do a ton of stealth infiltration without needing the first-person camera, and allows us to experiment more with Raiden's CQB moves, the bread and butter of third-person gameplay. And secondly, it symbolizes Raiden and the player's desire to be someone else. I'll cover both of these briefly in the order they come up. First, the CQB. To get the directional mic that we'll need, we have to go to the computer room, which is full of unsuspecting and easily distracted guards. When exploring this room, you'll see a pile of Playboys on top of the lockers, and if you kick them, typically a third-person move, they fall to the ground and can be picked up. This room is one of the only play areas in MGS2. We just filled our inventory with Playboys to distract the guards, and we're wearing a disguise. It's practically impossible to avoid the temptation of messing around with these guards for a bit before moving on. And almost all of that messing around will be done in the third-person mode. We haven't had any real need to use CQB moves yet, so this can be seen as Raiden showing the player all the cool things he can do without the player needing to breach his head by going into first person. So, once we have the directional mic,
You must be Ames.
We see the only place in the game where we're absolutely required to use CQB. We have to put a guard into a chokehold and shove his face into the retinal scanner. Raiden's forced to do what third-person view is best at, and it can be seen as a bit of liberation from the first-person camera that non-disguised stealth sort of demands. Once we get past the retinal scanner, we have to use a bit of subterfuge to pull out the directional mic, go into first person, and listen to all of the hostages' heartbeats. Once again, we're taking control back from Raiden and making him share his eyes with us, and what follows is a cutscene in which we can't get out of first person no matter what. So now on to the second point of the disguise, the last remnants of Raiden and the player pretending we're someone else. When Ocelot gets suspicious of Raiden, he pulls off Raiden's mask and thus ends the charade. Not just pretending to be the enemy soldier, but pretending to be Snake. It's at this point that Raiden becomes his own person, and it starts with Olga saving us from Ocelot, and us making a frantic escape. We now have to go through the same area we snuck through with third person, only this time we're using first person as well, and we eventually arrive at the Shell 1-2 connecting bridge. If our Snake fantasy didn't end with Ocelot pulling off our mask, then it ends here, 10 minutes later. We don't need to project Snake onto Raiden anymore. We take him across the connecting bridge from Shell 1 to Shell 2, and with that, Raiden's completely out of his loop that was Shell 1. He can finally start being his own player character, rather than just a cheap imitation of Snake. When we get to the connecting bridge, we go deeply into first-person view with Raiden to shoot some explosive detonators whose IR sensors are blocking a path across the bridge. Raiden doesn't pout and defy like he did during and after the Fortune fight. He's perfectly fine with us going into first person for an extended sequence of sniping detonators. We finally got the same relationship we had with Snake in MGS1, a mutual understanding. We don't have to pretend that Raiden is Snake anymore, so, with no more need for the player to pretend Snake isn't doing his own thing somewhere else in the big shell, Pliskin finally reveals himself to be the real Solid Snake.
Are you the Snake? They said you were dead.
No, not me. There are still too many things I need to do.
And Raiden and Snake can peacefully coexist and work together as a team during the Harrier fight rather than Raiden trying to be Snake. They're both their own guys, and that's fine. The Harrier fight also requires extensive use of first and third person, a theme for almost every Raiden boss fight. They're meant to test how well we work as Raiden, sharing the responsibility between first and third person. However, the S3 plan that the plant mission was designed around wasn't supposed to have Snake involved. Raiden was supposed to try and pretend to be Snake throughout the entire mission, but with Pliskin finally revealed to be Snake at this point, the entire mission starts falling apart, and after this cutscene we see one of the most ruined and destroyed sections in the entire game, and from here on we're in severely destroyed sections of the plant. The simulation fell apart, and so the levels follow suit. Also notably, thanks to the destroyed sections of Shell 2, we aren't able to make a full circle anymore. Raiden and the player were intended to continue on in the cycle of pretending to be Snake, but since we know that Snake is here and not dead, we can't, and Raiden breaks out of his cycle. Seeing as Raiden and the player both just gained independence from the Solid Snake myth, it's fitting that after the Harrier fight is a jump that only Raiden can make. If Snake tried to do his dive over this ledge, he would fall to his death. However, Raiden's somersault lets him clear gaps like this. It's as if Raiden is saying to the player, nice job using first person in that boss fight, check out what I can do in third person. You and Raiden aren't just one and the same, you're riffing off each other. Two separate entities working together to control the one. So now that the player has successfully fully merged with Raiden, the battle between first and third person camera usage isn't really a factor. They're both important and nobody puts up a fuss because we have to use one or the other for an extended period. So for this chapter at least, we'll skip ahead. Raiden's now been captured and is being tortured by Ocelot. We're forced into first person mode to save Raiden's life by mashing triangle during the torture. Notably, the torture room is an exact replica, even down to the texture detail, of the torture room in MGS1, and we enter Arsenal Gear where everything either looks like, or literally is, virtual reality. We're completely naked, and therefore have a slightly more limited version of the moveset we had in MGS1, so I consider this section to be even more of an MGS1 analog than the rest of the plant section. With no reason to go into first person without a weapon, we have to rely solely on not being seen, so this, combined with the MGS1 torture room, can essentially be seen as us going back into MGS1. However, with the GW AI having him as virus uploaded, the simulation breaks down and it's made absolutely certain that we're in a video game. I interpret this as a failure in the AI system that was made to trick Raiden into thinking he was in MGS1. The gameplay is the same as MGS1, the torture room's the same, but we're in a virtual world with computer code coming out of the walls. This signifies that the virus did in fact work, and that the simulation's about to break down entirely, which it does. We get the sword, and we're officially as far removed from Solid Snake as we can possibly be, counterintuitive to the S3 plan. Snake has never used a melee weapon at this point in the Metal Gear franchise, and we have no need to go into first person whatsoever. We also have to fight our way through at least 50 guards in all-out combat in the most video gamey thing in any Metal Gear game outside of Rising. We're not Snake, we're fighting Assault style with a sword, and Snake is right there with us. If there was any shadow of a doubt that we could still be Snake, it's all gone now.
What I do know is that you're standing right here in front of me, not an illusion, flesh and blood.
Raiden's no longer an object of the player, he's starting to break away from us, and as a result, he's finally seeing himself as being just as real as Snake is. After the Tengu fight, Fortune chooses Snake to battle, leaving Raiden feeling rejected and unmotivated. Once again, we both wish he was Snake, and so we go back to making him roleplay as Snake, doing what Snake does best, fighting Metal Gears. We have about 25 Metal Gears that need to be destroyed, or 2 if you're on very easy. So with Raiden trying to go back to roleplaying as Snake, we do a Metal Gear fight that's very reminiscent of the first game's MG fight. Interestingly, this boss fight takes place in the photo mode completion map from MGS1. After you beat the photo mode VR missions, you would be allowed to get closer and closer to a girl standing in the center of the arena, either Mei Ling or Naomi depending on stats. Since you have to beat 100% of the missions to get to the girl, she's painted as an object of desire, something we want to get closer to, and when you first appear in this arena in MGS2, it's Raiden that's at the center. We got pretty close to Raiden over the course of MGS2, but ever since he got that sword, he's been breaking away from us again, and so now we desire him once more. With Raiden wanting to be Snake again, he lets us hop back into his head, out of the third-person control of the sword and into traditional control of Metal Gear characters. But at the end of this boss fight, Raiden is officially done with the player, and done with playing Metal Gear. He just gives up. Whereas in other moments when we were having friction connecting with Raiden, he would act out of turn and spoil a good victory for us. This time he just says, I'm done pretending to be Snake. I had a taste of being my own person when I was using a sword, and I'm not going back to trying to be Snake for the player's amusement. We save Raiden in first-person view one more time during an infamously difficult choking sequence, and Raiden's officially done with the player at this point. He's not going to be a video game player character anymore. So, after a lot of cutscenes explaining why GW wants to control the world's perception of truth, and chastising Raiden for being incapable of independent thought, Solidus throws Raiden his sword, and it slices off his handcuffs. Just as the sword cut him off from the player and from traditional MGS gameplay, it now finishes the job. At this point, he's completely unshackled.
No more games, Jack.
We fight Solidus entirely in third person, using a totally different control scheme from anything else in any Metal Gear game, and then the game's over, and Raiden famously throws the dog tags with the player's name on them away. That's one hell of an ending, and it's more or less the main thing that fueled the speculative chapter, and drove all my ideas about Raiden and the player's uncomfortable but necessary relationship. He's so fed up with being controlled and manipulated by everyone around him that he just ditches the player entirely and leaves the game. Throughout the entire game, Raiden tries to become another person and adopt their perspective, Snake. Even when he acknowledges that he's his own character on equal level with Snake, he's still doing what Snake does and the same control scheme as Snake, and when he gets his sword he starts to become his own person. That's why he meets Rose in person at the end. He's done having Snake in the player's perspective projected onto him. He's finally becoming comfortable with his own perspective on life. Whether Rose is real or not doesn't matter, she's real to him. One last quick recap before we move on to the next chapter. We get in control of Raiden, pretend he's Snake, meet someone who's probably the real Snake and therefore start having a rocky relationship with Raiden via the first-person camera when defusing bombs. Raiden goes full third person and rebels during the Fortune fight, then we work together to defeat Fat Man. Raiden gets to go into third-person stealth as a brief reward for not messing things up with Fat Man like he did with Fortune, and we go first-person again to find Ames. We have our disguise ripped off and are forced to look at Raiden's face. Then we cross the connecting bridge and confirm that we're 100% not Snake, because Snake is right there in the helicopter. We connect with Raiden further and further until he gets the sword, where he starts breaking away from us again. He loses his sense of self after Fortune chooses Snake to battle over him, so he briefly seize total control of him for one last time in order to destroy Metal Gears, and he gives up, being completely done with the player. We fight Solidus in third person with a brand new, totally non-Metal Gear control scheme, then Raiden throws away the dog tags with the player's name on them and decides to be his own person, and see the world from his own eyes. Metal Gear Solid 2 can be seen as a constant series of inversions and subverted expectations when compared to MGS1. Let's start with Snake's mission, the Tanker. The Tanker is essentially a Cliff Notes version of the events of Shadow Moses, with a few small inversions and one big one. Snake arrives at a place that's been taken over, has a Revolver Ocelot-esque boss fight with Olga, sneaks into an underground base, shoots a Metal Gear at its weak points in first-person view, and is confronted by Liquid. This time as Liquid Ocelot. And of course, the big inversion, Snake dies at the end. The first area that Snake arrives in, the bow of the tanker, is similar to MGS1's Shadow Moses exterior. Notably, Snake arrives here from above via bungee cord, whereas he arrived at the Shadow Moses exterior from below via elevator. Once you get to gameplay, the area looks wide and open and has a similar feel to the Shadow Moses exterior, even down to heavy rainfall paralleling with the thick snowfall. However, it's much more constrictive. In short, it's filled with doors that could lead anywhere you could possibly think of, but only one of them is openable. This constriction carries on throughout the entire game. While the level design is interesting to compare to MGS1, what's more interesting is the dialogue. There's a ton of dialogue between Snake and Otacon, and the Marine Commandant's speech that constantly refer to an anti-Metal Gear in development. This is Metal Gear Ray, however, as the rest of the game suggests, it's also Metal Gear Solid 2. I'd like to take a look more closely at the Commandant's speech.
At the moment, every industrialized nation on the globe knows the specifications for Metal Gear. Worse yet, so do a number of rogue states. They are all working on deploying their own Metal Gear force to compete with the US's nuclear strike capability. The world is about to see a swarm of these Metal Gear derivatives. We initiated development of Metal Gear Ray as a countermeasure to these pirated weapons forces. The only thing that can stand up to a Metal Gear is, of course, another Metal Gear. With Ray, the hundreds, if not thousands, of Metal Gears that exist all over the world are no longer a threat. The blind rush to nuclear proliferation will be contained, and it will be the Marine Corps and our Ray that will accomplish this. This weapon will render all other Metal Gears obsolete. Nations building up their own Metal Gear force will think twice about their nuclear strategy in the light of the military dominance spelled out by Ray.
I'd get some flack if I didn't point out that some of the games I just showed, especially Deus Ex and Hitman, do some very unique things that no Metal Gear's ever done, such as Deus Ex's wildly large open worlds with hundreds of possibilities and branching stories, and Hitman's focus on blending in and interacting with NPCs in a much more personal way. Deus Ex is one of my favorite games of all time, and while I haven't played the older Hitman games, Blood Money and Hitman 2016 are both fantastically unique games in my book that fall into a subgenre of stealth that I don't think any other game series has captured. And I think that Thief is the more obvious inspiration for games like Deus Ex, as it came out only 2 months after the first Metal Gear Solid. Regardless of how different from MGS the games that it inspired are, or whether they were inspired by it at all, it seems like this speech about the Navy's plan to fight back against Metal Gear derivatives is a clear jab at some of the games that Metal Gear Solid 1 paved the way for.
The only thing that can stand up to a Metal Gear is, of course, another Metal Gear.
So what is this anti-Metal Gear Metal Gear? Well, only a few minutes after this speech we get our first look at it, the plant mission. While the plant mission is of course similar to the Shadow Moses mission, it ends up mirroring it, not duplicating it perfectly. The first and most obvious subversion of expectations is Raiden, and I've already covered him and the role he serves in some detail, but you really just can't put enough emphasis on how different he first appears from Snake. Whereas Snake is confident, masculine, and makes good jokes,
well, if you make it back in one piece, maybe I'll let you do a strip search on me.
I'll hold you to that, Doctor.
Raiden is insecure, boyish, maybe even effeminate,
You're a man?
and makes terrible jokes.
Did you say nerd?
Not nerd, node.
Oh,
Even physically, Raiden sort of looks like Liquid Snake. That's a major inversion from Solid Snake. There are plenty of parallels to Snake that, fittingly, don't get revealed until later, but for the first 2/3 or so of the game, he's about as far removed from Snake as you can get. This section will be a bit more like a list, but it serves to make a point about how constant the inversions are. Firstly, Raiden has to literally clean up the mess Snake left after knocking out the room full of guards. My preferred strategy is to drag the guards all the way back to the first room and stuff them in the lockers, which just furthers the idea of Raiden being in Snake's shadow. This is a clear inversion of how it went down in MGS1, where Snake most likely snuck around and toyed with the guards while waiting for the elevator to arrive. Secondly, and through the first half of the game, Raiden traverses Big Shell cyclically, whereas Snake moved through Shadow Moses by progressing and backtracking. I already mentioned that this serves to emphasize Raiden's cycle of insecurity brought on by him trying to roleplay a Snake, and interestingly, when Raiden fights the Harrier and starts being portrayed as his own person, rather than just Snake's shadow, he starts backtracking as Snake did instead of moving in a loop. Parts of Shell 2 are even destroyed so that he literally can't move in a loop. Thirdly, after our first loop around Shell 1, Raiden starts the bomb disposal section. In MGS1, at about the same point in the game, Snake has to use first-person mode to identify where to place the C4 to blow through the walls, and Raiden has to use first-person mode to find and defuse the bombs. This can be seen again as Raiden cleaning up after Snake when viewed this way, just as he literally had to clean up after Snake at the beginning. Fourthly, Emma Emmerich. Both games have us meeting an Emmerich who developed the main antagonistic machine, hides in a locker, appreciates Asian culture, has trouble walking, and wets themselves. Only Hal Emmerich uses the stealth camo to avoid slowing us down and becomes more brave, whereas Emma literally slows us down and is arguably a coward until her death. I had a few pages where I discussed the boss fights and how they related to their MGS1 counterparts, but it wasn't too interesting for the space it took up, but it's still valuable showcasing just how thick this game is with Metal Gear Solid 1 inversions, so I'll be more brief about it. After comparing multiple versions of the boss order of the plant with that of MGS1, I found no way of looking at the two boss orders that was as compelling as the parallels between the bosses when viewed out of order. This could play into the Chapter 1 idea of no analysis being devoid of holes. Each way of looking at the boss order had compelling parallels, but wasn't perfect. First, we have Fortune. She can be seen as paralleling with Snake's first encounter with Sniper Wolf in that he can't damage her, there's an impassable barrier between you, they're both the only female bosses if we're looking strictly at the plant, and they both fight because of dead family members. As for the inverse, Snake has to leave this arena to get a sniper rifle, and then he can fight back, but Raiden just has to deal with it. However, she also parallels with Vulcan Raven's second fight. They both use huge weapons to destroy the environment, and Raven compares his fight to an ear pull contest, a test of endurance, whereas Fortune's fight is literally a test of endurance. Fat Man, perhaps more compellingly, compares with Raven's second fight. The layout of the arenas are similar, and as for an inversion, Snake could place C4 and Claymores to defeat Raven, but Raiden has to defuse C4 to survive. The Harrier fight obviously parallels with the Hind D fight. One inversion is that Snake is in a helicopter during this fight, whereas our enemy was a helicopter before instead of a Harrier. Aside from that, there aren't really any other inversions here, which is fitting seeing as this is when we start seeing Raiden as being a lot more like Snake than he let on. If we're going off the assumption that Raiden crossing the connecting bridge and fighting the Harrier is when he completely becomes his own person on equal level with Snake, it makes sense that the next fight against Vamp mirrors Snake's first boss fight, Revolver Ocelot, almost perfectly. The two arenas have the exact same layout, with the same placement of the ammo and the entrance and exit. However, Vamp uses knives and goes straight into the center of the arena, whereas neither Ocelot or Snake could go into the center in MGS1. A lot of the boss fights have secondary parallels with Volk and Raven for some reason. Again, like Raven, Vamp places claymores in places where he's been, with the inverse being that he places them in spots where you and Emma have to walk through, whereas Vulcan's claymores can be avoided. The sniper section where we cover Emma is most similar to the first Sniper Wolf fight, but has a significant amount of inversions. Firstly, Raiden isn't at any personal risk. The only way to get a game over here is to let Emma be killed. We're shooting guards instead of one person, and while Sniper Wolf used Meryl to draw out Snake because she knew Snake was dangerous, Vamp taunts Raiden with Emma because he isn't afraid of Raiden at all. Also notably, after this section in MGS1, Snake is tortured by Ocelot, and very shortly after this section in MGS2, Raiden's tortured by Ocelot in this exact same torture room. The Tengu fight doesn't really resemble anything in MGS1, which is fitting since Raiden is completely detached from the Snake myth at this point, playing with a totally non-Metal Gear control scheme and with computer code leaking from the walls. If I had to draw a parallel, it would be with Grey Fox in the elevator ambushes of MGS1. Next is the daunting fight with 25 Metal Gear Rays. I don't really need to go into detail on how this compares to Snake's fight with Rex, just look at it. One thing worth noting though is that Raiden is officially much more powerful than Snake, having destroyed more Metal Gears in one fight than Snake has in the entire time we've seen him in the series. Raiden's only weakness is that he has no idea who he is or what he's fighting for as of yet, whereas Snake knows those two things exactly.
I'm here because I was assigned to this mission, not because I want to. If I could, I'd be out of here in a second. How could you come back to all this? Why keep fighting?
There's something my best friend said to me once.
What?
We're not tools of the government, or anyone else. Fighting was the only thing I was good at, but at least I always fought for what I believed in.
However, Snake didn't always know what he was fighting for.
Snake! What was she fighting for? What am I fighting for? What are you fighting for?
If we make it through this, I'll tell you.
Okay, I'll be searching too.
And we can take solace in the fact that, eventually, Raiden will know what he's fighting for as well. Lastly, of course, is the Solidus fight on top of Federal Hall. This obviously parallels the Liquid Snake fight on top of the destroyed Metal Gear Rex. It's almost all melee. However, Solidus doesn't survive this fight with Raiden, whereas Liquid does survive the boss fight with Snake, at least for a bit. This symbolizes that Raiden's finally more powerful than Snake when he uses the sword rather than the Solid Snake moveset. While the plant mission has plenty of inversions from the first Metal Gear Solid, from Raiden looking like Liquid Snake to a female Emmerich to defusing C4 instead of placing it, I'm more interested in how it inverts the tropes of these so-called Metal Gear derivatives. After all, according to the Commandant's speech, this anti-Metal Gear was made to combat the derivatives, not Metal Gear Rex, Solid 1.
We initiated development of Metal Gear Ray as a countermeasure to these pirated weapons.
Freeze!
This section's going to be a lot more speculative, and more just a fun way of looking at how art inspires art, and more specifically, how Metal Gear Solid 2 sort of actively refuses to be inspired by the games that came between it and the first one. I had a section here comparing Deus Ex, Hitman Agent 47, and No One Lives Forever, A Spy in Harm's Way, to Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2, but for the sake of brevity, I'll get straight to the main theme I found in all three comparisons. Metal Gear Solid offered the illusion of immersion before making us question that feeling through the fourth wall breaks, and theoretically as a response, Deus Ex took some of that game's ideas and focused on being as immersive as possible while providing a wealth of narrative choices. Hitman Agent 47 took some of the inherent silliness of stealth games and capitalized on it by having a disguise system that generates a comedic moment at least once a minute, while No One Lives Forever seems to have tried and captured the tongue-in-cheek aspects of the plot, with over-the-top spy thriller running throughout. On a surface level at least, all three of these games look like a Metal Gear Solid game, sneaking around, getting into mischief, messing with guards, but all of these so-called Metal Gear derivatives lack one key feature that Metal Gear Rex had: the intentional undermining of immersion. That's why we need Metal Gear Ray, an anti-Metal Gear, to double down on the lack of immersion to combat these games. Metal Gear Solid 2, like MGS1, sets up the sense of escapism the games are so often cited as a source of, and then brutally denies it, There is no escape from reality, from your perspective on the world. You can never truly be someone else, no matter how immersive the game you're playing is. While these examples, and indeed almost every game, never acknowledge the player, never break the sense of being someone else, the Metal Gear series, and particularly Solid 2, force us to acknowledge that we'll never truly be immersed when we're playing someone else's role, adopting another person's perspective. Anything other than being ourselves is just a game.
Why not? This is a type of role-playing game. The point is that you play out your part, and I expect you to turn in a perfect performance.
There are a few examples outside of the Commandant's speech that point me to seeing MGS2 as a response to stealth games that predated it, like Kojima happily showing us what would actually happen if someone tried to wear a disguise and remain mute like Agent 47 does, and one quote that always struck me as odd.
I know you didn't have much in terms of choices this time.
It's not like MGS1 was full of choices either. You could give in to Ocelot's torture and have Meryl executed, but that's about it. However, as a response to Deus Ex and similar games' powerful ambitions towards escapism and immersion, that quote starts to make more sense. MGS2 wants us to acknowledge that there's no such thing as true escapism as long as you have your own brain inside your head. You can never abandon your perspective. While there are plenty of effective works of art that focus on dozens of different themes, such as Deus Ex, my personal preference in most cases is art in which every aspect points to one core theme. Metal Gear Solid 2 manages to have the best of both worlds. While there are plenty of minor themes such as conspiracy, transhumanism, and destiny, these are all present only in individual moments of the game. However, throughout every second of the entire game, we see three major ideas that all point to one core message. Each of the three preceding chapters focused on one of them. First, the manipulation of truth, which is represented through the GW AI, the secrets that are slowly revealed to Raiden over the course of the game, and the secrets about Raiden's past he hides from the player, from Snake, and from Rose. Secondly, the player's inability to connect with Raiden, on top of the fourth wall breaks that disconnected us from Snake in the first game, and two, we just plain don't like Raiden. He isn't sly and badass like Snake, he actively rebels against the player as in the Fortune fight, and when we finally do start to like Raiden, he starts breaking away from us further and further. And thirdly, the idea that there's no such thing as true escapism, which could probably be combined with the former idea, but for the sake of keeping in line with my chapter layout, I'll keep them separate. The first Metal Gear Solid also played with this theme, but here it's one of the most important aspects of the game. We'll never truly be immersed as someone other than ourselves. All we can do is roleplay, and Metal Gear Solid 2 forces us to acknowledge that. So how do these tie together? Subjective truths. We'll never be able to see the world from someone else's eyes, think the way they do, or know things the way they know them. Because of this, we can never truly understand the world that we live in as a species. We can only understand the world we live in as individuals. 1. Plenty of people lie to us, or don't tell us the whole truth over the course of Metal Gear Solid 2. And GW wants to cleanse the world of these lies and misinterpretations of fact. That's why it's the villain. It would rob us of any freedom to decide for ourselves. All we can do is decide which fiction, which subjective half-truth we're going to believe in. 2. We can't connect to Raiden fully, because to do so would be to transcend the human senses. All we can do is believe in our own subjective truths because we can't inhabit other people's minds. And 3. There's no such thing as true escapism, no matter how immersive you make a work of art. Again, because to truly escape would mean to inhabit someone else's mind and adopt their subjective truth. We'll never know anything outside of our own subjective truths, so all we can do is sort out the meaning behind a mess of slightly conflicting information. This is, again, why MGS2 has such a convoluted plot, and why it points out that Snake went through Shadow Moses in his own way. It's encouraging us to keep believing our version of the Shadow Moses incident the way we played it, and our version of the Tanker Plant incident the way we perceived it.
But everything you felt, thought about during this mission is yours, and what you decide to do with them is your choice.
Metal Gear Solid 2 is incredibly important to me, and as a result, I'm going to talk about myself in this outro more than I typically do on this channel. Its message, as I see it, is that our own perspective on art and philosophy is correct to us, and that you shouldn't listen to anybody trying to say otherwise. While my videos have all in all been positively received thus far, there's always somebody saying that I misinterpreted something, or that I'm not correctly analyzing the message in a work of art. Metal Gear Solid 2 argues that there is no incorrect way to analyze art. If something is true to you, it's as true as it'll ever be. Whenever I see one of these comments, no matter how politely or logically put they are, It always makes me question whether I'm an idiot for not seeing things the way the commenter did. And sometimes I'll put off making videos or lose motivation as a result. But then I think about Metal Gear Solid 2. It encourages us to come up with our own ideas about the world and art, and to share them. Whether those ideas are right or not is never the point.
It's not whether you are right or wrong, but how much faith you are willing to have. That decides the future.
Many of you might not agree with my analyses, but that doesn't mean they aren't true to me. When a creator gives an authoritative answer to questions about their work's meaning, they take something away from the art. Imagine if somewhere there was a Stanley Kubrick interview that explained in perfect detail what everything in The Shining meant and symbolized. That movie would instantly become more boring to watch for people like myself who love analyzing things. Metal Gear Solid 2 is probably the most important work of all time for me and how it relates to my life. It played a huge part in my decision to start making these videos, and even when one of them gets lightly trashed in the comments, I think of MGS2 and remember that I'm the only one who can take away from, or disprove the way that I see things. I'm not ignorant for seeing something a different way than someone else. It only shows that we're both human. MGS2 tells you to trust yourself and your sensibilities, no matter who says that you're wrong. Objective truths are almost never the point in art. If art as a whole is about one thing, it's the inherent subjectivity of the human experience. How the creator sees the world and how the viewer sees the world don't always fall in line, but through their art, we get to experience, however abstractly, applying our own personal philosophy to the creator's ideas and perspective. Following this logic, every work of art becomes a work that's about the viewer. We project our own thoughts, ideas, and experiences onto the art we observe, and as a result, we learn about ourselves with every passing second of observing. We're all just humans with a limited set of senses, and will never truly know what it's like to be another person. So all we can do is understand and accept our own subjective truths.
Who am I, really?
No one quite knows who or what they are. The memories you have and the role you were assigned are burdens you had to carry. It doesn't matter if they were real or not. That's never the point. There's no such thing in the world as absolute reality. Most of what they call real is actually fiction. What you think you see is only as real as your brain tells you it is.
Then, what am I supposed to believe in? What am I going to leave behind when I'm through?
We can tell other people about having faith. What we had faith in. What we found important enough to fight for. It's not whether you are right or wrong, but how much faith you are willing to have. That decides the future. The Patriots are a kind of ongoing fiction too, come to think of it. Listen, don't obsess over words so much. Find the meaning behind the words, then decide. You can find your own name. And your own future.
Decide for myself?
And whatever you choose will be you.
I don't know if I can.
I know you didn't have much in terms of choices this time. But everything you felt, thought about during this mission is yours. And what you decide to do with them is your choice.
You mean start over?
Yeah, a clean slate, a new name, new memories. Choose your own legacy. It's for you to decide. It's up to you. By the way, what is that?
Dog tags.
Anyone you know?
No, never heard the name before. I'll pick my own name, and my own life. I'll find something worth passing on. They taught me some good things, too.
I know. We've inherited freedom from all those who fought for it. We all have the freedom to spread the word, even me.
Snake, what about Olga's child?
Don't worry, I'll find him. Count on it. As long as you keep yourself alive, he's safe.
Do you know where Liquid went?
I put a transmitter on his ray.
Did he head for the Patriots?
Yeah, but I have a feeling they gave Ocelot a bogus location to begin with. Cheer up, we have a better lead. This contains the list of all the Patriots.
But Ocelot took it.
The one we gave you wasn't the real thing.
What?
This virus is coded to destroy only a specific part of GW, namely the information about the Patriots' identity. Which means that there's a parameter coded in here that defines what that information is.
I get it. Analyze the code and you can probably find out where they operate. Count me in.
No, you have things to do first. And people you need to talk to.
Snake?
What's wrong?
Nothing. Can I ask you something? Who am I, really?
I wouldn't know. But we're going to find out together, aren't we?
Oh. Yeah.
See me for what I am, okay?
I know.
Do you remember this place?
Of course. This is where we first met. I remember now.
Hmm?
Today is the day I met you.
That's it.
I think I found something to pass along to the future.
What?
He said all living things want their genes to live on.
Are you talking about the baby?
Yeah. The genes aren't the only thing you pass on. There are too many things that aren't written into our DNA. It's up to us to teach that to our children.
What kind of things?
About the environment, our ideas, our culture, poetry, compassion, sorrow, joy. We'll tell them everything together.
Is that a proposal?
This is for your ears